start and then people can trickle in. Can I start on this one real quick? Is that possible? Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming and welcome. I appreciate you all coming despite competing events. I'm here to present to you the finest refugee research team on the entire East Coast, possibly in all of America. But I want to really start by thanking Aida Vidan and Anna for their hospitality at the Center for European Studies. I want to thank the Boston Consortium for Arab Regional Studies, BCARS, whose logistical and financial infrastructure enabled this research. Deputy Director of BCARS is here, Mr. Charles Simpson, and I encourage those of you who are interested in collaboration opportunities and learning more about related projects to really reach out to him. So I've had the privilege of working with these fantastic people on this project over the summer, which took us to 5 countries, the ones you saw listed. The data we've gotten is really phenomenal. We're very excited about it. We hope that you will, in the articles that are coming over the following months, for your reading pleasure, I hope you will look at them, because the data sheds light on a number of underlooked aspects of this refugee crisis and refugee dynamics more broadly. Not only do we have these stunning, really stunning refugee narratives in 140, 150 in-depth interviews, which go on for hours and hours, which are really stunning. We also have issues of migrant-smuggler dynamics. We have very important issues concerning risk-taking and decision-making and the process of decision-making during forced migration. And perhaps of interest to Center for European Studies audiences in particular, we have a lot on their perceptions of Europe, on how they perceive Europe, on why they decide to often risk their lives to go to Europe. Conversely, on why the ones that do not go to Europe decide to stay in, say, Jordan or Lebanon. How they, what their expectations are in Europe, whether they wish to stay, the conditions under which they wish to stay, and generally how they represent themselves and misrepresent themselves according to their perception of Europe. So, can I also quickly plug, because I know there are some undergraduates in the audience, that in the spring I will be teaching a course for the Sociology department called Refugees in Global Perspective, which is an undergraduate course, and it is the only course on refugees offered in the Harvard catalog. I encourage, I know some of you here are already planning to take it, but those of you who have illusions that there are alternatives that are better should consider taking it in the spring. It also fulfills certain requirements for your secondary concentration. So not only would you immerse yourself in this important phenomenon, but you will also get the pragmatic benefits of that. So the significance of refugee fieldwork should be obvious to you when you pick up a newspaper and read about East Aleppo, where 200,000 people are in a situation that the United Nations described as the most, the United Nations described them as the most vulnerable population on the planet right now, with Turkey's incursion into Syria in addition to Assad's offensive on Aleppo. Many people are drawn to the conclusion that the beginning of the end of the war is in sight. But, of course, the tragedy is that if the Syrian civil war were to end tomorrow, the refugee crisis would still be there. If, unimaginably, if all wars in the Middle East and Africa were to end tomorrow, the refugee crisis would still be there. When all the cameras and the Twitter and the journalistic interest and the scholarly interest goes away, the refugee crisis will still be there. So, as many analysts have pointed out, this refugee wave of 2014 to today is, as one expert put it, the new normal. And our hope today is that, with this panel, is that refugee fieldwork will also become the new normal. And we have with us 5 very courageous people who took that intellectual leap to conduct this kind of fieldwork this summer. You will be, I'm sure, very inspired by a lot of their stories from the trenches. But beyond that, I really invite you to reach out to us to build a little community to work on related issues together, because as you'll hear in these stories, it's one thing to sit comfortably and to bemoan the sad fate of refugees, and it's quite another thing to take that leap of faith that this team did to go into the field and to go into refugee camps and all that comes with that. So I hope that after the panel you will reach out to us with opportunities for collaboration, for learning, and for organizing together. So to save time, I'm just going to quickly introduce all of them at once in order, in sequence of speaking from, it's kind of the reverse of the Balkan route. It's going to be from Germany towards the Middle East. First, we're going to have Anna-Elisabeth Schmitz, who is a journalist and freelance writer in Germany. She holds a BA in Journalism and Public Relations and an MS in Global Studies and International Relations, focusing on conflict resolution in particular. She was a Fulbright scholar and is currently beginning her PhD work in Germany, where she single-handedly conducted research for our project. Alex Terzikian is a law and public health dual degree student at Northeastern School of Law and at Tufts Medical School. She is originally Syrian. Her legal interests include the intersection between public health and international human rights law. She's done extensive work in several refugee camps in Lesbos, and then she joined the research team in Thessaloniki as well, so she will talk to us about her experiences in Greece and in Greek refugee camps. Abdullah Al-Mutabagani is an undergraduate at Northeastern, majoring in politics, philosophy, and economics, and as a freshman, remarkably, at the tender age of 18 or 19 or whatever, he didn't go to the Microsoft internship or whatever it may be, but jumped into the Lion's Den in Greece, where he also researched in the refugee camps. He is originally from Saudi, and he conducted research in Greece and in Turkey. Thomas Lord is a master's candidate of security studies at Boston University. His work focuses on political violence with an emphasis on Southeastern Europe. And during the summer, he gained an expertise in extremist Greek political groups, among other things. So he conducted fieldwork in Greece and Turkey, including during the failed coup attempt in Turkey, which we hope he will touch on. And we will end with Maysam Al-Ahmed over Skype, God willing, if technical matters go according to plan, who is our woman in Jordan. Based in Amman, Jordan, she is originally also from Saudi Arabia. She holds a Bachelor in International Affairs and Political Science, and she is a consultant for the ILO, the International Labor Organization. She's worked as a researcher for 2 years for BCARS, including work for this project in Jordan. So I invite you to welcome them to Harvard today. Lisa can kick us off.
Thank you, Daniel. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I would like to start off with by throwing a few facts, numbers really, at you, to give you some background on the situation, the refugee situation in Europe in general, and in Germany, where I was in particular. So the 2015 surge marked the largest annual flow of asylum seekers to Europe since the mid-'80s, since 1985. Europe hosts only 6% of the world's displaced persons. However, refugees there did not disperse equally across Europe. Some countries have taken in more asylum seekers than others. For example, Germany, since 2012, has been the primary destination country for asylum seekers in Europe, receiving 477,000 applications in 2015 alone. But this number, 477,000, does not really correspond with the actual number of refugees in the country, because it usually takes a while until they file for asylum, the refugees file for asylum. So that, in fact, the number of people that reached Germany in 2015 was about 1.1 million. Since the Balkan route has been closed and the EU and Turkey have reached a deal that has largely halted the flow of migrants through Turkey and Greece, the number has gone down significantly. From January till September this year, 2016, only 272,000 refugees reached Germany. And to put this into perspective a little, so in September 2015, so September last year, 169,000 refugees were registered in Germany, first time registered, alone, so in this month alone. Then in September of this year, the number of applicants was down by 90%, which is approximately 15,600. So that's a lot less. And at this point, you may ask yourself why I'm throwing all these, or I'm telling you all this, because numbers really are deceiving. So when you think about it, 40% of the refugees in Germany are from Syria. So 40% at this moment, or at this point, 40% out of almost 1.4 million people in Germany are from Syria. And that is, if you do the math, it's approximately 560,000 people. So I thought it would be really, really easy to find the required number of 30 or so refugees that I could interview for the study. But I couldn't have been more wrong, or maybe I was just too naive. It really wasn't that easy. And if you know how we in Germany pride ourselves with being super efficient, it really has a downside to it. We are also very, very thorough. And when I say that, I mean that in capital letters, bold and underlined. And that sometimes really can be an obstacle too, and it certainly was for me. I have two stories that I want to share with you today in this context, and they seem like they are stories of failure, but really, and they, at the time, they certainly felt like it too. But now, in retrospect, they are actually two successful stories, and yeah, I want to share these today with you. So, story number one. The now mayor of my hometown is did I get this right? Is my parents' neighbor's, or is married to my parents' neighbor's daughter. So I know him, we are on a first name basis, and I thought, when I asked him, it would be like child's play, getting access to the refugee camp, aka tent city, in town. But it really wasn't. And when I talked to him, he said that as much as he would like to help me, he really couldn't. And when he told me that he couldn't help me, I was stunned a little, or not. Yeah, I was stunned, because he's the mayor of the town, and if the mayor doesn't have the power to get you inside a refugee camp, who has? So who was I supposed to turn to if I wanted to get in touch or wanted to meet refugees? And I started thinking that this whole journey would probably be a lot more difficult than I had anticipated that it would be. So he said that the reason why he couldn't help me or couldn't give me access was that I apparently hadn't been the first one to ask him, and that the town, or he himself, gets about 2 to 3 requests, other researchers per week, and that it was simply too many because the well-being of the refugees was at stake, and that taking good care of the refugees was really the town's, or had to be the town's, main priority. So, but he did want to help me nevertheless, and what he suggested was that I spoke to a group of volunteers that he knew and who had, still has, this group has personal contact with refugees in my hometown. It's a volunteer initiative, they do really good work there. And he even came with me on a Saturday or Sunday, there's definitely a weekend, on the weekend, to talk to them, or when I met them for the first time, I guess to, I don't know, lend some weight to my request. But it didn't really help much because they outright refused to help me. They doubted my intentions and the overall value of the study, and told me in my face I wasn't qualified enough, because they thought that with my questions, so I told them what I wanted to do, I would ask them, and they thought that I would harm the refugees with my questions. So they didn't want to break the trust of the refugees by asking them to sit down with me and talk to me. That is not what I had asked them. I would have asked them myself, but I needed someone to break the ice for me. So I explained it to them, but they wouldn't help me. So yeah, but after a few minutes of discussion, they allowed me. They have a Facebook group, and they allowed me to post something on their wall. And the group has a lot of refugee members as well. And they said that even though they wouldn't go and ask them or make initial contact, if they read it, the refugees read it, and they volunteered to participate, that was fine. And why is this a success story? Because this Facebook post, as weird as it felt like posting it felt like putting out or posting a contact ad, really. In the end, this Facebook post really became my most valuable resource. So I got three initial replies, private messages, not even under the post itself, but private messages, and the refugees telling me, yeah, we will help you. But it turned into more than 10, 12, I think 13 contacts that I made. And moving on to story number 2, I went to Berlin to meet refugees or to talk to refugees in a camp there. And when I say camp, this is really not, it's really a camp only by name. It was more like a communal accommodation space. And one of the expert contacts I had made earlier arranged access for me. But even though I got the okay from the vice manager of the camp, when I showed up one Wednesday morning at 10, the director or the manager there, he literally kicked me out. And I'd never been kicked out of anywhere before, so I was shocked and a little, at least. And my contact, he was furious because he had this all planned out so well. And then he drove me to another one of those spaces that was close by, but they didn't want to give me access either. They said they had to talk to the company that ran the place first, and then I would hear back the next week. They they got back to me 2 days later, and guess what they said? No access here, for the very same reasons. The guy at the first camp, he threw me out for the very same reasons I previously mentioned, and these people, second camp in Berlin, they said no access for the same reasons as well. And so they said kind of the same, like the Facebook post, if I wanted to put up flyers in Arabic or any language, I was more than welcome to. But because I don't live in Berlin, it was really hard to follow up on this, so I didn't want to do that. And then because I didn't want to return home empty-handed, I called another contact out of the blue I had made earlier, and I actually reached him at the airport. He was on its way to Connecticut to some sort of alumni meeting, and he instructed a lady in Berlin to help me to get in contact with refugees there. And the irony really is that the lady, I spoke to her on the phone, and she said, well, if I'll talk to them, they probably say yes because they wanna give back. We helped them before, they'll say yes because they want to help you. So I guess why I'm telling you these stories really is that there's always a way to get in contact with refugees, but that sometimes, at least that's what it was like for me, that you come to a point where I got into a moral dilemma, so to speak. So I was operating within the German system where the refugees are entitled to a maximum of protection, and obviously this is good, but at the same time it made it really hard to get close to them. And the officials from the camps, they decided for the refugees that by sitting down with me and helping me, that they probably get harmed. I obviously couldn't rule that out, but I couldn't even get to them. Whereas the lady in a private setting, not an official setting, but a private setting, she let the refugees decide for themselves, but at the same time I was willingly accepting the fact that maybe they would sit down with me, and it was not in their best interests because I might actually harm them with my questions. I didn't know when I first met them. So that's the first point that I would like to make today. And then there are two more things that I would like to mention. I would like to briefly talk about how sometimes it can be really difficult to build trust with the people sitting in front of you, especially as a native of the country that you're going to question them about. So in my case, I'm German, and I was in Germany asking the refugees questions about how they like Germans and how they like being in Germany. And to be honest, at first I was totally oblivious to the fact that this might even become an issue. But in retrospect, I think that it was actually a good thing that I didn't pay attention to it at all. At least at first I didn't, because I didn't constantly think about how I was I had to present myself. I didn't pretend I was someone else, someone I wasn't. And at least I think that the refugees felt that I wasn't pretending, that I was just, I don't know, being myself during the interviews. And when some did hesitate to answer that question, or the questions that I asked them about Germany and the Germans, how they were treated, and how they liked it, the culture, and when they would hesitate, I don't know, it was a gut feeling. I just would encourage them to speak, I don't know, freely. They could tell me or speak freely about their feelings, that I wouldn't judge. And I was kind of neutral. I was Switzerland. And then the last point that I wanted to make is kind of linked to my previous one. I would like to say a few words about the kind of relationship that I built or established with the refugees during the conversations. And I actually think that I had a very Germany-specific experience, because in Germany I was able to speak with people that had already left the formal camp setting and moved into their own places. And they had, all of them that I met really, they had nothing left. And it sounds really cliche, but that's the way it is. They have nothing left but the hope for a better future. But they still made every possible effort to make me feel really, really welcome in their homes. I had countless coffees. I don't even drink coffee, but the Arabic coffee I can drink. I was treated to sweets. We had homemade cookies, and at first I felt really weird because I was eating their food. But one of my Syrian contacts actually explained to me later, or during the interview in English, that it was just that's just how Syrians are, very, very hospitable, and that refusing their hospitality would be offensive. And really, it seemed like that some, or most of them actually, were glad that I was there to listen to their stories, because when they have their interviews for the asylum process or the application in Germany, it's in a very, very formal setting, and they're in a lot of performance pressure. So that's one reason that I've come up with why they treated me so well, or made me feel so welcome. And then there's one other reason. It's kind of, this is where the circle kind of closes. I'm almost done. That the one other reason might be actually that, so in the debrief section of the interviews, we asked them if there was anything else that they wanted to tell me, or that they wanted to say. And many actually said that they wanted to say thank you. They felt grateful that Germany has given them a second chance, and that they could be in Germany. So maybe the reason that they treated me so well was actually because I was German, and that they did in some way wanted to give back, at least in that moment.
Thank you, Lisa. Alex?
Hi everyone, thank you all for being here. My first point I'm going to talk about is the differences between doing humanitarian work and research work, and the importance of being able to identify in what capacity you're working in. Before meeting the research team at Thessaloniki, I went to volunteer in Lesbos for a small Dutch NGO, the Boat Refugee Foundation. As a Syrian who was fortunate enough to leave Syria at the start of the war, I knew I would not feel satisfied by simply conducting research. I wanted to see the immediate impact of doing humanitarian work, such as doing basic activities with children, getting to know people on a personal level, versus research work that tends to be more academically focused. That is why I went there first. In Lesbos, there are three main camps. Moria, where everyone has to go, that's where they get registered, and it looks like a detention center. Karatepe, where they're mainly children and women. The conditions there are a bit better. and Silver Bay, which houses the most vulnerable refugees. Working for an NGO allowed me to gain information about all these sites and access to all these sites. And I think getting to know the camp dynamics and knowing what each NGO there does is very helpful. I obviously made it clear from the beginning that I would only be conducting interviews during my free time or whenever I didn't have any volunteering shifts. And I think it's really important to be able to distinguish yourself in terms of what role you'll be playing. You need to be clear that you're conducting these interviews within your research capacity and then volunteering in the realm of humanitarian aid. Conducting research in Lesbos would have been very difficult if I hadn't been familiar with these sites, just because they're all very different and they're all scattered throughout the island. When I didn't have volunteering shifts, that's when I went and I conducted a few in-depth interviews and surveys. And again, it's important to be clear in what capacity you're working in and make sure that the refugees are also aware that you're doing these interviews for research purposes. Because in a way I was registered through the NGO, I was in the camps representing them with their logos and vests, and so I didn't want to create any type of confusion. In comparison, in Thessaloniki, without having an established connection with any NGOs there, because the conditions there were quite worse off. There weren't any NGOs that were allowed to work in the camps in Thessaloniki. And I think a big part of that was in order to avoid the magnet effect of refugees. And this is the idea that if they were to provide good services, other refugees would be inclined to go there. And so the conditions there were very dire in order to deter other refugees from coming. And so it was much harder for us in Thessaloniki to know exactly where each camp was located. And this is where being flexible, thinking on your feet, and gauging how much information you might be able to gain from people that you come in contact with was key for us. On our first day there, I remember we were on our way to one of the camps, and this older man came and approached us and asked us how to validate his bus ticket. Given the man's accent, and as we began talking, I realized that he was Syrian. He was very talkative, and so we told him about our project, and he was very willing to participate. And so in a split second, we decided to divide up into two groups and follow this man to this other camp that we hadn't heard of yet. And so I think being able to determine who key informants might be and how much information you might be able to extrapolate from someone, I think is an asset to have, especially when you don't know where these camps are located. Most of these camps were located outside of the city, and especially when you're working with a short amount of time. The second point I want to make is about one's identity. Being true to yourself, knowing who you are, and knowing that different people might view you differently given where you're coming from as a researcher. I think those are things that are important to keep in mind. For me, as a Syrian myself, this put me in a unique position. On one hand, it was very easy for me to start a conversation with someone, and I developed a personal connection to them. But then on the other hand, we were also very different, and I had to constantly downgrade how my life actually was in the US in order to try and equalize power differentials. As one refugee put it, we're both Syrian, but at the end of the day, you get to leave and I remain here a refugee. And so overall, I think this was a very rewarding experience, but also difficult at times, because in a way I had a lot in common with them, but we were also very different. At one point, I chose to change my name to Noor in one of the camps because I knew that some were going to doubt that I was coming from the region if I had introduced myself as Alex, which is clearly not a Syrian name. It was automatically going to give away that I wasn't, that I was either from a certain region, or that I wasn't Muslim, or that I came from a privileged area in Syria. And so I also tried to avoid saying where in Syria I was from if I wasn't asked explicitly. Given how divided Aleppo is, whenever I was asked, then I would just make sure to explain to them that our research project wasn't pushing for any political agenda. As a Syrian, I also felt bad for having this privilege when I could have just been one of them. After conducting several interviews and having gone to different camps, I began to realize that the magnitude of the issue was bigger than I had anticipated it to be. When I thought about the greater scheme of things, you know, I only managed to visit a handful of camps, and I was only in 2 cities in Greece, and I began to think of the other camps that I didn't manage to go to, like the 1,000 of camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and I just felt like this small person, and I didn't know if our study was actually going to have an impact. And I felt guilty too because I was interviewing these people on sensitive topics. I had them re-go through their difficult journeys and open up to me when I couldn't really guarantee how much of an impact we were going to have. But then after talking to a Syrian girl who was around my same age, she also wanted to study law, and I was very inspired by her because she managed to start a small elementary school in one of the camps on her own. And I realized at that moment that feeling guilty was not going to be productive. Instead, I realized that it was better for me to own my privilege and leverage it to empower others. If there was going to be any sort of impact I could make at a minimum, it would be to share the stories of these people and put a meaning and life to the words that they were sharing with me. And lastly, the third point I want to make is about always being aware of your surroundings. This brief story is not to scare anyone away from conducting fieldwork, but I believe it's an important one to share. I honestly always felt safe in most of the camps. As a Syrian woman, in one of the camps in Thessaloniki in particular, we bonded with 3 guys who were around our same age. And whenever we went into that camp, I felt as if I had like 3 bodyguards walking around with me in the camps. Every 30 minutes while I was conducting interviews in tents, they would come check up on me, make sure everything was okay. And I constantly had family members back here in the States asking me, oh, are you sure like the conditions in the camps are safe for you? And I would reassure them by telling them the story. In Moria, however, which had refugees of different nationalities and different ethnicities, there tended to be riots whenever arguments would escalate between 2 refugees from different nationalities. One occurred while I was conducting an in-depth interview inside of the camp, and it began because a Syrian refugee was triaged to be seen due to his emergent needs over an Afghani refugee who had been waiting several hours to see a doctor. And so when that occurred, when I got notified about the riot, everyone had to be evacuated. So I just made sure to note the time at which the interview had ended, and I explained to the family what had occurred, and told them that we would hopefully resume the interview at another point. But I think I just wanted to make this point because even if you're focused on conducting your interview and you want to make sure that everything is going as planned, things like this can occur. And so I think it's important to have some sort of spatial awareness and try and assess the environment that you're going to be working in. I tried to do research on Moria before going there, but given how inhumane the conditions are there, I couldn't really find a lot of research before I was there. And so that's where having an established network in place and following a certain protocol, having that in mind is key, because I think if I would have gone in as an independent interviewer, as an independent researcher, I would have been at a greater risk. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. Abdullah.
Okay. So I'm going to begin by imitating my colleague Lisa by enumerating some of the figures in the region. So to this day, there is approximately 2.7 million refugees in Turkey, so approximately 3 million in Lebanon, and 600,000 in Jordan, nearing a million, I'd say. I say this to bring into consideration first of all, I'd like you to take also into consideration the country's populations, their economies, and their political stability. In this sense, I'd like to clarify that I think personally that this is very much a Middle Eastern refugee crisis more than it is a European one. And I say that because I'd like to highlight the two different kinds of distress that the refugees are suffering from. The distress refugees are suffering from in the Middle East is more of an immediate one. It's the type of distress where they still can't meet their day-to-day needs comfortably, and it's a distress that they have just fled war to reach Turkey, where they're facing a similar type of insurgency. Whereas in Germany, I believe it's more of a cultural distress, and I think my colleague Lisa would also agree with me that. Nevertheless, I still think that both types of distress are apparent in both countries, but I believe some are more frequent than others. And in that case, actually, Greece is a European country, but when it comes to this type of distress, I'd very much consider it more of a pseudo Middle Eastern country, just because of the conditions the refugees are living in. In Greece, I had to keep in mind that I might be speaking to someone who has risked their life to cross the Aegean, known today quite popularly actually as the Syrian grave, only to realize that the borders are closed. In Turkey, I had to keep in mind that I might be speaking to someone that fled Syria in hopes of reaching Europe, and then also realizing that the borders are closed, or someone who was shot at the Turkish border. Maybe even faced reminiscent political insurgency. And I say this because the issues, generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, when it comes to smuggling routes, the more expensive, the farther the trip, the more expensive the trip is going to be. So the well-off, if they have the funds, they make it off to Germany, and the less wealthy will stay in Turkey. And the cheaper the trip, generally, the riskier it's going to be. So the ones who've made it to Turkey, possibly the land route itself throughout Syria could be as dangerous or more dangerous than crossing the Aegean. And especially post-coup in Turkey, the team, me and Tom, generally had a very hard time breaking the ice with a lot of the refugees in Izmir. We had to, when we wanted to make a couple of cold starts and just introduce ourselves to some random refugees, we had a hard time coming along with that. And Support to Life conducted a vulnerability assessment of Syrian refugees in Istanbul, and when the refugee organizations when the organization asked the refugees which organizations they trusted least, the leading answer was Syrian fellowship organizations, with international organizations closely following up. So it's easy to understand when the Syrian refugees are having a hard time trusting each other, how they're going to react to trusting an outsider. And I'm saying this because just to illustrate how sensitive the Syrian refugees are at that point, and how you have to be very aware of the most minuscule things when approaching them. Like Lisa said, they're going to be offering you tea, coffee, cigarettes, and it's important to notice that these things are somewhat rituals, just to break the ice and for the refugee to understand you. So during fieldwork, I believe whether it's watching TV or playing a card game with them, I think it's substantial to intimately build trust and therefore just getting better data. In our case, we had heard that the Red Crescent set up a refugee camp in Manisa, Turkey. So me and Charles rented the car and wanted to explore the camp, essentially. We make our trip only to arrive that there wasn't, only to see that there was no camp set up, and we come across a small rural Syrian Kurdish farmer community. We approached them. They were very polite, very modest. However, they rejected our request to interview them. The refugees gave us a very clear response in saying that prior to our arrival, they have been faced by the Turkish authorities of that municipality and gave them a reason to fear them, essentially, because they had been interviewed by a journalism company prior to our interview, and their faces were broadcast around the country. They had probably complained about some living conditions, and then the Turkish authorities showed up in plain clothing, gave them a reason to be afraid of them, and told them not to speak to any journalists ever again. So we showed up, we clarified as much as possible that we weren't journalists and that we are academics, and just tried to gain their trust, essentially. Being a Saudi and talking Arabic with them kind of made it a lot easier with us, especially that Charles here also speaks a good amount of Arabic, and being a foreigner, showing them that he's genuinely interested helped us in gaining their trust. So we sit down among maybe, I'd say, 10, 15 Syrian Kurdish refugees, and these somewhat rituals start to begin. First of all, they presented us with qahwa murra, or bitter coffee as it is directly translated, which traditionally is served in one cup, starting from the eldest male in the room and then descending. And you just take a sip of the coffee and you pass it on. I had noticed that they were serving it different. They served it just from right to left, and the person serving the coffee had used the wrong hand. So after that, I used that as a platform to discuss how we're slightly different. I think as irrelevant as it seemed, I think that was very important in discussing, in gaining their trust, essentially. Another thing that happened was at one point, one of the refugees asked me had I prayed the sunset prayer, dusk, excuse me. And I hadn't at the moment, so I got up and I prayed with him. And Charles noted that two or one other refugee were sitting on the side observing me, seeing if I actually knew how to pray properly. Luckily, I passed that test. And after that, we nevertheless gained their trust. We got the interview. It was a relatively short one. Nonetheless, it was an interview with some very important data. And from this, I'd like to point out another thing, that because there's such a sensitive population, being in an interview automatically shifts sort of the power of a discussion in your direction, because you're the one dictating the flow, you're the one asking the questions. A sensitive person will take note of this and will attempt to shift it in their direction. So in an interview, if you notice that the subject is being aggressive, tries to ask you questions, the best course of action is to comply. Let that person take the wheel for a while, and you just try to probe with some certain questions here and there, not seeming too aggressive or authoritative. And for example, as a Saudi, being a person from the, so when it came to my identity, I was trying to look at the pros and cons of being a Saudi. So one of the pros are I happen to be Muslim, I speak Arabic, and the cons, it keeps on going downhill from there. So of course I was interrogated for why the Gulf countries had not accepted more refugees than they did, and at this point I could have told them that technically Saudi Arabia did accept 1 million refugees under the sponsorship system, but that wouldn't have I wouldn't have gotten my message across properly. So what I did was I aligned myself with their views at the cost of my national pride, and condemned the Gulf countries and my country, which actually is a view I do very much believe in. And instead of arguing with them that Saudi Arabia did in fact accept refugees. And in this case, a little bit of self-loathing can really go a long way. And to be frank, that was probably my best advantage. And so I think the next issue we faced was not issue actually, what we managed to work around most was the informal structure of things. At first, when we arrived to Diavata in Thessaloniki, we were trying to gain access into the camp, but we unfortunately didn't have a letter from the Ministry of Interior. So Tom here automatically went to talk to the police officer at the door and try to build a good relationship in hopes that in 2-3 days we actually get inside and get our data. Prior to that happening, we were interviewing refugees from across the fence. So we were sitting on the ground interviewing refugees with a fence in between us. That in itself isn't the best because it already somewhat pollutes the interview because the subject is there sitting down looking to you through a metal fence, and that can only put his mindset it can only exacerbate it essentially, for him to realize that you're on the outside, you're free, and they're on the inside not being able to leave. Tom unfortunately actually did gain the trust of the individual, but he said that there's an NGO inside of the camp that is more or less running things, and they weren't going to let us in. We found out the name of the NGO, which unfortunately escapes me at the moment. When we were done with the 3 days, the Ministry of Interior actually sent us an email after 2 weeks of us spamming them, essentially trying to find out if we can get in or not. And Interior sends us an email saying no, N-O, that we're not allowed to go in. Nevertheless, we went in, making sure that we avoided that specific NGO, me and Alex, and got our data. And the second time we had to work around this was in Oriocastro, also in Thessaloniki, where we faced the same problem. And Tom spoke to the police guard and heard about how the police guard had no problems with the Syrian people, except that he thought, okay, I better leave that out. Excuse me. So we're still having trouble of walking in. After the second or third day, we decided to proceed with the same procedure, go with the same procedure we had in Diavata, whereas we're just gonna walk in hoping that they don't notice. I was keeping in mind if the police guard was gonna confront me, I'm just gonna talk in Arabic, and I'm just gonna be another refugee in here. I was just a part, kind of. We walk in and we get confronted, and he pulls Charles aside and tells Charles that you two are not authorized to enter. I continued. But of course, without missing a beat, Charles says that the Ministry of Interior had emailed him saying that the police officer were the boss. So Charles is talking to this police officer saying, the Ministry of Interior told me you're the boss. And the police officer goes, yeah, of course I'm the boss. And he let Charles in straight away, and we managed to actually stay in Oriocastro for a good amount of days. We found our fixer, essentially, who managed to give us a very good random sample of the population there. And all in all, that's all I had to say.
Thank you, Abdullah. Tom.
Yep. I'm Tom. I had the pleasure this summer of spending time in 6 different camps across Greece, and then in Turkey we saw some urban sites where Syrians had integrated. And I've just plucked some themes here from my field notes that just recurred and were really prominent. And I'm going to actually kind of reverse order because of one of Abdullah's anecdotes that segues really nicely into this. So I just wanted to speak for a moment about some of the glaring contrasts of the dynamics of the crisis in Turkey versus those in Greece. Starting with Greece, it was very clear when I arrived in Greece, it was much worse off than I had left it 3 years before, which that's saying something because in 2013 it was in very bad shape. And now we had this crisis. And one of the things that really stood out and I thought was really impressive on both sides, there was a mutual understanding of one another's plight, so Greeks absolutely understand what it is to be a refugee, and will tell you that segments of their population have been so 3 or 4 times in the 20th century, depending on who's counting. And there was not a single Syrian that I spoke to that did not understand that Greece was a terribly economically depressed country. Nobody held Greece accountable for their situation. The refrain was, "Where is Europe?" And why have they turned their backs on us and on Greece? And something Abdullah had mentioned in the beginning of his segment, he was saying that Greece kind of felt more like an Eastern country, where it certainly had a lot more akin with Lebanon than it did Germany. And this is a very old theme that occurs again and again in Greece, and they accept this, and they consider themselves the exterior periphery. And so a big concern of Greece in 1999, when the Dublin Accord talks were happening, we're going to have this system where somebody steps foot in any country in Europe, and that is where they're to apply for asylum. Well, if you look at our geography, we are the gateway of Europe, and we're going to be disproportionately affected by this. So the St. Petersburg tasks were crafted, and everybody had an understanding of their obligation in the event of a humanitarian crisis. None of those obligations were met, and this is a truism, and everybody knows that, but that was kind of what informed the situation in Greece, and both sides understood that. In terms of interactions between Syrians and Greeks, it was nuanced. There was nothing politically correct about it, but it was very genuine. Especially in Athens, something we heard a lot down by Piraeus port. Greeks, those working in kiosks or bartenders would disaggregate the migrants, and they would always say, "Well, the Syrians and the Iraqis, those are the good ones, but the Afghans and the Pakistanis, those are the ones that come here and commit crimes, and the Egyptians and the Moroccans." And I asked them about that, and I tried to dig towards some of the features that they thought set Syrians apart as like a better or a well-behaved group. And they said, well, look, when they come from these camps down here on the port, Syrians come and they buy hygiene supplies and things for their kids, but the Moroccans are just always, lurking around looking to steal money for cigarettes or something. And they had these prejudices, and they were absolutely ridiculous. But really, it seemed the thing that connected the Greeks I spoke with, especially the working class Greeks, to the Syrians was this shared sense of identity of having been a refugee, as well as these really weird revanchist Greek attachments to Levant and that part of the world. One of the most striking aspects of Greece was the fact that there is absolutely nothing for refugees. The only vestige of the UNHCR we saw were wash buckets and a few tents, but they were usually outnumbered by personal tents, Coleman's that had been purchased by the refugees themselves. Médecins Sans Frontières had pulled out of the country as a political protest over the EU-Turkey deal, despite not having a political mandate. So where there was 24-hour care in a lot of the worst camps, that was pulled immediately. In the 6 camps I went to, only one had 24-hour care, medical care 7 days a week, and that was provided by a Greek Coast Guard corpsman or corpswoman that was working like 14-hour shifts. And then absolutely no access to housing and no access to the labor market. Their passports were seized. Once they arrived on either Chios or Lesbos or one of the entry islands, it was replaced with the makeshift passport. Those kind of evolved over the process. The more recent iteration looks more like a passport. Doesn't have very much information. Things are just kind of filled in at random. Questions are asked that don't really apply cross-culturally, like what is your patronymic or your matronymic? Like that would be important, so they would just fill those categories in at whim. A lot of the refugees, especially those coming from Central Asia or irregular migrants, whichever term we're to use, this was their very first time ever having their fingerprints taken. A Eurodac, it was their first time ever having any formal documentation of who they were. And a couple of things that featured prominently on these passports that replaced their passports from their country of origin. One, it was made clear in English and Greek, this person does not have the right to work in this country. They could open up a bank account and they could make cash transfers, but even informally selling flowers in the street or a cab driver, they did not have any access to the labor market whatsoever. which is understandable because Greeks can't get jobs as cab drivers, but that was one of the biggest problems, and this will dovetail nicely with another theme of mine, and that is just kind of the danger of humiliation and boredom and being immured in a strange country that you know nothing about and where you really can't get any help to speak of. But just really quickly, I wanted to shift to some of those dynamics in Turkey that were completely different. And the numbers have already been thrown out there, but this is just staggering. I mean, Greece has 60,000 refugees, but in Greece, the crisis is the event. It has affected every single aspect of Greek society. Whereas in Turkey, remarkably, there are 2.5 million, roughly, Syrians, by my count. I might be slightly off. And on the surface, it didn't appear that that had really affected Turkey. I mean, Turkey is one of the 10th largest economies in the world. It's a powerful country, and they had the capacity to deal with it. Syrians in particular are given temporary protected status when they get there. They're issued an ID card with a number akin to a social security number. They have access to medical care, housing, labor market. It will not be the best job, but a lot of them end up in pretty decent condos. They're a little crammed, but it's a far cry from what you have going on in Greece. The other odd contrast, though, is that despite the poor conditions in Greece, there was a lot of freedom of movement and kind of autonomy. I mean, there's a very low saturation of law enforcement, and no one's really going to tell you what you can and can't do unless you're trying hard to get into trouble. But Turkey, on the other hand, especially following the coup, was the least permissive atmosphere you could imagine. There was very deep paranoia. When I was in Ankara, it was really unsettling because this was about 3 weeks after the coup, and the buzz in Turkey was that it was an inside CIA job, and all Americans anywhere near the embassy, which I was staying 2 blocks away from the U.S. embassy in Ankara, and the people that ran that Airbnb were very suspicious of me as well. That's probably just to do with a shady character, and I might encourage that kind of perception. But I mean, there was just extreme paranoia, especially towards Americans. And so, as I was trying to get interviews, in one of the few slums that remains in Ankara, which was a pretty modern city, that same day, a British academic from University of Kent had just been detained. She didn't have proper documentation. Well, you couldn't get proper documentation when we would give it to you. Whereas in Greece, if I can recycle your anecdote, you send a minister an email asking them for access, and it takes 3 weeks to get an email that says, no. So no one's really running the country unless you can charm the cop with the keys. But in Turkey, the bureaucracy was really strong, and there was a great deal of paranoia. And the weird thing was, the paranoia was very internally focused. Like, you could tell the police officers that were very edgy with you were edgy because they themselves had just had a shootout with the army, for God's sake, and were very uncertain about the trajectory of their country. So those are just some of the contrasts that stood out to me, and maybe if something crops back up, I'll touch on it again. This other one is kind of an odd theme, and so everybody this is a truism, and everybody acknowledges that if you're a refugee, you're an underserved population. But it's interesting to me to disaggregate some of the demographics there. And given my identity, and prior to this, I knew very little about Islam. I had never really done work on Arab region studies. I knew nothing about refugees. And so the majority of the people that I interviewed personally, or that I just spent a lot of time hanging out with in camps, making ethnographic notes, sitting in dirt, smoking countless cigarettes, just sharing their boredom, were males my age, and the really soulless term we use for this demographic, but appropriate here for refugees, is fighting age males. They are, as I said, everybody's an underserved population, but this is one that worries me, and nobody's going to argue on the hierarchy of needs. Of course, insulin for diabetics is important, and prenatal care are extremely important, and these things take a precedent. And it's absurd to have this conversation, especially when we're talking about Greece, but something that worried me quite a bit was the mental health or lack of care for what I'm calling fighting age males. So I just have a few anecdotes, if you guys will bear with me. When I first arrived in Athens, the first place I went was my favorite neighborhood, Esarkia, which enjoys a reputation of kind of being an enclave of anarchists and hoodlums and all of that. But I sat down at my favorite bar, and I met this Cypriot NGO worker, and she is a child psychologist, and she was working for a day center called Pharos. And she had a really interesting story that kind of fleshed out over the next couple of days, and I got to meet one of these boys. But she was working with two young men, and they presented a really interesting contrast. One was a 15-year-old boy, and he had been a guerrilla. He had fought with the FSA in Aleppo, and he was very proud of it. He had this Polaroid picture of him with an assault rifle and RPG-7, and he wouldn't take any orders from anybody in the day center. He was totally autonomous. He was very proud. And he wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't, harassing the other kids or anything like that. He was just, he had established himself as an adult. And I should mention too, by the way, her specialty is in working with kids that have experienced conflict-related trauma. She started with this in Cyprus and then worked for a while in Afghanistan. The other young man that she pointed out that she thought was really unique was a 17-year-old man, and he had fought, but not willingly so, and he didn't really like talking about it. He was very withdrawn, but he was a very large kid, unlike this 15-year-old kid that's kind of like the scrappy Napoleon archetype. This was a really large kid and a very sensitive kid, and obviously a very thoughtful kid. He was having a really difficult time in the school that had been set up in the day center, and he was also getting bullied, and he would just withdraw, and he really didn't want to deal with confrontation, despite the fact that he could have polarized any of his peers. And so that's something that she's continuing to work through, and that interests me. And moving on with this theme of fighting age males, I guess why this theme is important to me, if I can add this footnote. When I returned from the Eastern Mediterranean, I went back home to Arizona, and I went to a wedding, and I had a conversation with some friends. And this rural Arizona, good old boys, and a lot of these people went to the Marines right out of high school, and their sentiment was, well, what kind of man runs from their country when it's at war? Why do you not stay and fight? And had I my wits about me at the time, and maybe not, it was a wedding, I had imbibed a few drinks, this would be the idea that I wanted to present to them, and so the next guy I'm going to mention anecdotally is my friend Wael. He's very dear to me. He's 35 years old. He's a very cosmopolitan, interesting guy. He plays the piano, the oud, speaks Russian, French, English. He's a network engineer. He's 35. He and his 16-year-old brother Mohammed escaped from Deir ez-Zor, and it had pretty much gotten as bad as it was going to get there. ISIS had taken over their town. They were slaughtering people, but what did it for him was the possibility of conscription. He had already fought for the Syrian Arab army, and he just didn't have a stake in this fight. Both sides were tearing his country apart. Furthermore, what worried him was the fact that in 2 years his brother would be of fighting age for the Syrian Arab army, but his brother was already of fighting age for one of the three major factions that had controlled that part of Deir ez-Zor, and that informed their decision to escape. Their parents had already died, and at that point, that was more important to him than his country, which he loved very much. Last one, and I have about 1 minute here. This guy had a really nuanced view of the fighting. He lived in eastern Aleppo, which is controlled by the opposition, but he worked in western Aleppo. This guy was a deep patriot. He also had been a veteran, done his mandatory service. But when he crossed into West Aleppo to go to work, he would be harassed and threatened and considered a traitor when he was in the regime side. And then every night returning home, he would receive the same kind of harassment or just as brutal treatment from the opposition. And this is purely his opinion, but he had every grievance that you would expect him to have with the regime, but he also held the belief that most of the people in Aleppo especially were not from there. They were outsiders, and they were ripping it apart. And he said, there's no way that you can be from my beautiful city and have done to it what these outsiders did in the name of a revolution that I don't want to own, and none of my neighbors want to own. And so that was a theme that just stuck out to me, and I think it's something that should be addressed, because I don't think there's anything more dangerous than boredom, humiliation, stagnation, the inability to provide for yourself in a foreign country. And if anything is going to cause people to boil over, I think it would be that combination of factors.
Thank you, John. Now for the grand finale, we have one final brief presentation from Jordan. My son will appear magically, I believe. Hello, my son. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
We are all attentively listening. My son, we are all attentively listening.
Oh, okay. Just a reminder, you guys have to speak into the mic because I can't hear you otherwise. Hi, everyone. I'm speaking from Jordan, as you know or might not have known already. So I'm going to talk briefly about how I got into this field research and working with refugees, and then go into some of the stories and experiences I've had for the past 2 years that gave me knowledge on how to basically gain the trust of people around me. So briefly speaking, I started working in field research about 2 years ago in 2014 when I was still an undergrad. It all started when I was working, when I was taking a class and I had to write a paper, and I realized there was no material for the research that I've been looking for and wanting to do. So in the summer of 2014, I took my first trip to Jordan and decided to do my own primary research, just because I was so frustrated that there wasn't enough information about the topic I was doing. And basically that's how I got into it. I started off as a student and doing my own research, while at the same time being a research assistant to one of my professors and a couple of other colleagues as well. So I'm going to give you sort of the both sides of, I worked as a translator. If you are a foreigner who's going to be working with a translator, what are the things to look for? And if you're going to do your own research on your own, what are the things to look for as well? So 2 years in, I've had a lot of experiences and learned some things the hard way and some the easy way. To begin with, I've worked as a translator a lot at first. And just to go straight off of that, some of the pointers I want people to basically know is that if you don't speak the language and you have that language barrier, that cultural barrier, it's okay to depend on your translator to help you out. It's very important to meet with them beforehand, give them an idea about what's going on, the research you're working on, what you're looking for, because while you're conducting the research, it's easier sometimes to have the translator know what you're looking for, because a lot of things get lost in translation, and you are looking for something specific in your research and you want to reach that, but you're finding difficulty because the translation process that's going on. So you want your translator sometime to just go on instinct. They know what you're looking for, they know what you want, they know the information you're looking, they hear the stories, they understand the culture and the language. So take that as an advantage, that this person knows a different aspect than you, even if they're just a translator, even if they have no experience in the field, they do have some level of expertise that you are unfortunately unable to access. So take good advantage of that. I think it's very important to let them, sometimes if they want to go off, do that. And then just right after the interview is over, sit with your translator and be like, okay, what things did I miss? Don't worry about translating word for word on the spot, because that just kills sort of the momentum that's going on. When you're speaking to someone and they have to stop every 5 minutes or every 1 minute for your translator to give you the exact word for word translation, you're going to lose that momentum, that they're going to maybe lose interest, they're going to forget some points that they want to share. So sort of have an agreement with your translator, be like, maybe communicate important points, but keep in mind and help me record what is going on. So after the interview, we can, meet together and write down these important points. This way, you're making sure that you get every possible point that you want, every aspect of the interview, every mood, every part of the story, every detail, exactly the way you want it, and you don't lose so much of the information that happens during interviews due to the fact that you have a translator in between. Another thing I've found that's very important when working with a translator is that if, for example, I'm the foreigner speaking to a refugee and my translator is sitting over here, but I'm asking a question in English and waiting for my translator to translate that question, direct your question to the person you're interviewing, even if they don't understand what they're saying. And when they talk back, keep the eye contact with them. Honestly, don't look at your translator and be like, what did they say? What did you say? Can you tell him this? Can you tell them that? Always direct what you're saying to the person you're interviewing, regardless or not you understand or they understand you back. This way it makes the interviewee feel that the person that you're interviewing feel much less tense of the situation, and that you were respecting them and speaking to them, even if they don't understand. Just nod your head, try to understand their mood and what's going on, and basically base off of that and the few notes that you get from your translator, just look at your translator. Oh, right, that's what you said. Okay, that's great. Can you give me more? And then the translator would come in and be like, can you give me more in their language? So that's very important when working and trying to, engage into that culture, and you have that third person in between, and you don't want to lose that connection that you can easily build off of someone you're interviewing directly. And maybe even have like certain codes or ways to deal with certain situations with your translator. I remember one situation I was helping a student who didn't speak Arabic at all. And we were interviewing this old man who was probably in his 60s. And I was like, we're both listening carefully to his story. And then out of the blue, he just burst into tears. He was just talking about his parents and how they've just been gone through much. He was like, saying stuff like, back in Syria, we were like a charity organization and I used to help people, and today I can't even find like 2 dimes or something to take a cab. I can't feed my parents. My mother is sick. My father is disabled. And he just burst into tears in the middle of describing that. And I understood what was going on, but my friend who I was translating for didn't. So she kind of panicked, and I'm a very sensitive person, so if someone starts crying in front of me, I'll burst into tears as well. That's something I'm going to go into as well in a few minutes. But we immediately realized the situation, and we've spoken about this before. So we both decided that when a situation like this occurs, when you have somebody who's so emotional and can't keep up with their story and they're crying, and I as a translator can't even keep going, because if I translate what's happening to the person sitting next to me, I'll burst into tears. And for me personally, the number one rule is just you don't cry in an interview with someone. You don't, get into that same mood as that person for lots of, ethical, humanitarian reasons. Anyway, so he burst into tears, and I had to stop, because if I talked to her, and she realized that, she knew that there was something going on, that I couldn't tell her immediately what was happening, that we were going to save that for later, because he's emotional and I'm getting emotional with him. So I decided to take charge, as agreed beforehand, to sort of lighten up the mood, and first of all, wait for him to catch his breath and stop crying so heavily. And then I looked at him and said, if you need to stop, we're going to stop right here, right now. We don't want you to feel uncomfortable. I want you to be feeling okay throughout this so we can stop. He was like, and then he said himself, he was like, no, let me let it all out. So he just was using this as a venue to sort of lift off some of the pressure that he's been feeling lately. And I was like, it's okay, whatever you want, we're here for you, we're going to listen. And we gave him the time. There was another person with us in the room who was sort of, we were in a house, and she was the host there, so she went up and she brought some water for everyone. We cracked some jokes, and it took us maybe 10 minutes for everybody just to calm down, regain our situation. He calmed down as well. He drank some water, and I was fine. I took the 10 minutes that he needed, I needed as well, so I can go back on track and talk and be able to translate. And I realized as well that maybe going back into what caused him to cry immediately was not a good idea. So what we did is we went back, and I knew the questions beforehand. That's something important to share with your translators, that they should know all the questions and be like, I'm going to skip to some easier stuff for now and deal with that. And then if I find that he's open to come back to the earlier point, do that as well and rephrase it. If you don't think so, it's okay, skip it. It's nothing is worth causing someone to go through that. You just have to remember that as well. So I had to deal with that situation both as a translator and as an interviewer myself. Another important thing that I would like to mention is sort of how to gain the trust of people around you depending on the situation. First of all, when you go into a whole new different culture like the Arab culture, you have a lot of things that are different from where you are from, so that's important things to know or learn about beforehand. So, for example, a lot of things that, and maybe a lot of you know, is that, you know, women don't like to talk when there are men around, or they feel intimidated, or if you're trying to interview a woman, you find her husband or brother or father or whomever is trying to take over. And that happened a lot to me. So sometimes I have to interview a woman in her household or her apartment or in the camp, and then her husband or brother or whoever would walk in and would already be there, and you can't really kick them out. So it's okay if they want to be a part of it. If she would feel more comfortable having her husband there, let them. If you think the husband would be okay for him to be there, let him stay there. If you think you asking him to leave or wanting this private could cause problems, just don't. You don't want to get these people into trouble. You want them to trust you and open up to you and speak to you about every single detail that's important for your research. So if I'm sitting with a woman and I feel like she's like her husband keeps interrupting or keeps, you know, every time I ask her a question he would want to answer, I would try to engage him, be like, let him speak out. I was like, oh, that's great. Thank you for that information. What does your wife think? Try to have them both engage into the conversation, even if you don't need what he's saying. But that's an important note to even consider in your research. You don't want to get this person into trouble, but at the same time, you want her to feel comfortable. So, you know, sometimes, you know, crack a joke or let the husband speak for a while and be like, oh, does your wife think the same thing? And try to, if I ask a question to the wife, I can't think of something right now, and then he answers, try to rephrase the question to her. It's like, okay, that's great that you think that. What about you? How was it for you? So, okay, for example, we're talking about, they're telling you about their journey from point A to point B. They went through these challenges and these obstacles. And the husband was like, oh yeah, we saw this person. And that person was like, okay, so your husband saw, did you see the same thing? Did you see something different? Were you in a different section with the women? What do you think the other women say? This way you're engaging both. You're making them feel comfortable, not shoving the husband out of the picture and sort of creating an uncomfortable situation with both. And at the same time engaging the wife into the conversation in a way that the husband's like, okay, I'll let her speak to you as well. And with more of these situations, you'll learn how to deal with different personalities, especially when it comes to like cultural aspects and sort of norms of each situation. Another thing to point out is that, you know, we're researchers, we have a specific thesis and we come with a specific agenda and questions, and we're like, I want to get an answer to every single question. The one thing I learned that is most important when going in field research and speaking to people is that what you have in mind isn't always going to happen. So you have to keep an open mind and be flexible. You know, you don't have to go through every single question like a survey with as if it's an application or something. You want these people to give you details. Sometimes you, for example, if you come in with 5 questions and you only answer 3 is better than the 5 because you got the greatest details on those 3 than you would have if you just went basically on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The reason I'm saying that is that people sometimes get comfortable and want to talk about one thing more than the other. Just let them let it out, you know? They want to share their stories, they want to share these details. So it's important to have these people just talk about it, and trust me, you will get better information than if you just sat there and sort of bugged that person to limit their questions, because even then they will be flustered and frustrated and feel like they're not treated like human beings. They're not treated respectfully. They're just another subject. So you have to give them that feeling of, you know, we are having a conversation, more of like I'm interviewing you for purpose or for information. Just in a way, always think that, you know, even though you're a researcher and you're there with an agenda, the person sitting in front of you is essentially a human being who has suffered so much. What would you want if you were in their place? Because I hear a lot of people be like, yeah, I've been interviewed a lot, I'm not interested.
We have 1 minute.
What's the difference? What's that like? Your personality could be the difference that gives you the information and getting the information that nobody else was able to acquire just because you were more respectful of that person. Don't worry if you spend hours just with one person. I remember one interview lasted for about 3 hours with me, and I honestly had, yeah, it was supposed to be like 40 minutes and it turned into 3 hours.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have 1 minute.
Okay, That's okay. That's just one final note. It turned out into 3 hours because I spoke with the person. I got an incredible amount of information, and it connected me to other aspects of the research. I don't want to go over time here. I know we're in a short time, so I hope this was great information for everyone, and I am very open to discuss anything more in the question and answer session. Thank you.
So the panelists are happy to, but before the Q&A, I know many of you are rushing out. If you are interested in the research, if you would like to read it when it comes out in various forms, or if you would like to collaborate in any way, we are going to have a sign-up sheet here. I would cherish that the idea that before you rush off at any point, which you're free to do during the Q&A, you can discreetly come here and sign up to learn about the project. We have a microphone, I believe, that will be passed around if anyone has questions, thoughts, concerns, accusations. And please, if you could introduce yourself and address it to a particular panelist or a number of them.
Sure. Isra Sabah. I go to Northeastern University, and thank you all for sharing your experiences. They're both heartbreaking and heartwarming at the same time. Tom mentioned a little bit about the mental health of refugees, and I wanted to ask if interviewing them, did you think that it was therapeutic, they were actually getting something out of it, or did they feel that you were actually interfering or imposing on their lives? And Abdullah said that in a way some of them got aggressive or a little bit defensive. So how did you think the interviews affected them? Thank you.
It could go either way. I was in Oreo Castro, which is one of the more infamous camps north of Thessaloniki. It now houses a lot of the people that were at Idomeni before it was cleared out. And everybody there was very sweet. And then I had an appointment, as those go in refugee camps, to speak with a guy that was known as a doctor, who was also offering, he was a teacher, he was offering English classes in the camp. Everyone said, yeah, he's nice, he's great, it'll be fantastic. So we sit around tents for a couple hours, and this guy finally shows up. He finished doing his laundry or whatever, and I'm like, all right, this is going to be great. And he just basically grilled me for like 15 minutes and was like, none of this is going to help us. It's opportunistic on your end. I'm not getting anything out of this, and I'm tired. You have no idea how many people I've translated for, and I'm just sick of it, and I don't want to be part of your game. And I respected that and accepted my rear chewing. And after that, I think we were cool. But it depends. I mean, some people, it was really gracious, but I think it would be unfair and that it would be self-aggrandizing to think that we did anyone favors over there. I mean, I don't think it was therapeutic for anybody to have them recount some of the things they went through.
Can I quickly add to that? So I also agree with what Tom just said. That was probably the most difficult thing I went through while working in the field. It's facing this person, sharing their pain, wasting their time, and essentially you're not helping them in any material way. Unfortunately, that's how the world of academia works, where it's a very abstract matter, and hopefully it's quite possible that this project won't actually come into effect or won't ultimately help someone that we spoke to, and will only come into effect 2 generations down. I think it really boils down to the individual and how they're working, but I think if you don't honestly believe that this work will come to the benefit of these people, you're somewhat wasting your time in the field.
There was a question here.
Hi everyone, my name is Ryan. I am sort of involved with this in like the back end. I also have experience conducting interviews or surveys in Jordan. I had more trouble administering examinations when I was being sort of like a volunteer teacher, because people, both children and adults, would sometimes give each other answers, and like I think that's just sort of a cultural difference. I had to learn the word ghosh, which I think means cheating, really quickly. Yeah, okay, good, it's the right word. So one of my workarounds was to administer surveys in written form and then pose the questions orally, usually in Arabic. And the reason I had to do that is because I would teach girls sometimes in groups, and you're not supposed to do one-on-one. You can't. They are uncomfortable with it. I'm uncomfortable with it. Probably if I ever go back there and if I'm doing interviews with people, it would be a shame to. It would be indefensible to just kind of cut out the half of the population you want to interview that are women. So, is there a better way to interview if you are a man and they are the opposite gender, and is there a better way than just giving out written surveys and then having that be what they use?
It's these are one of the things that are just hard to address, especially if you are working alone. Unfortunately, this is just going to be one of those things you have to write in your research was a barrier. But one way I could think about it is that if you have everybody in a group and you have, let's say if you're, putting out the survey for girls, let's say at the age of 18 or so, or younger, who would have women teachers, their teachers or mothers, or somebody who is sort of seen as a hierarchy in that, or like in that place that you're in. So if you're, for example, in a camp and you want to survey girls from 14 to 16 years old, and you as a man is uncomfortable for you to be there, to have the women, either the women's security there or the teachers, to help you out if you don't have a research assistant. It is very uncomfortable for men to be alone with the women, and that's something that I honestly personally don't encourage doing if you're going for interviews. And I would suggest your number one thing is to, first of all, really try and find someone who could help you do that, a research assistant, a student, or somebody from the country. Like if you come to Jordan, you could ask for a female translator and then, sit down and discuss this. If you absolutely cannot, and you absolutely cannot even be there with a group of women who are in charge as well, so nobody feels intimidated that there's a male figure in the room in charge of or asking younger girls some questions or giving surveys or something that they're uncomfortable with, then you either have to just give them the papers and hope that they fill it out, or find an adulterer. But this is truly one of the most difficult situations. But the first thing that would come to my mind is, like I said, maybe having like their teachers there with you, and engaging with the girls maybe through them more than personally, just so they could feel less intimidated and more comfortable that they're dealing with their teachers rather than a strange male figure that they don't know. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a student at the Graduate School of Design, and I'm interested in, you mentioned this aspect of boredom, and many of the stories you hear about refugees is their ingenuity and the innovation and maybe the small economies they have, and what develops at the camps and maybe around the camps. And I was interested in whether you came across some of these, or maybe you didn't because it's illicit and informal. Maybe you can just share some of your stories on that.
Yeah, I got a couple. I'm gonna pass in terms of ingenuity, some of the first Syrians I met, there were 3 young guys. If you know Athens, you have Piraeus port. On the southern end of it is the main port. The port entry and the camp is kind of contained to a part of the gate. But people hang out outside of the camp in the terminal just because it feels normal. And I ran into these 3 Syrian youth, and they were all clustered around this external light fixture, and it had a bunch of cords hanging out of it. And after I started talking to them, I found out that every single night, they pulled the wiring out, charged everybody's cell phone on this surge protector they had rigged up, and then very carefully put everything back in every screw. So in terms of their ingenuity, there was no shortage of that. But there was just nothing to do. The informal economies existed. You see barber shops and people setting up, little food stands and things like that. But in terms of ameliorating the boredom, I don't know. I met some kids, especially at Oreo Castro, who in Syria, or one of whom was Palestinian. They didn't get into the deviant things that we can in the West. You're privileged to be a teenager and rebel a little and go smoke some grass or something like that. And that wasn't a feature of their life back home. But now that they were in Greece and they had just been there for 7 months they had found some like scheme to make money through some black market deal they had going on, and now they were selling hashish and like kind of turning into one of the Greek ruffians that hangs out on abandoned soccer fields, and they had incorporated into that, and that was their thing. It just depends on the individual, but generally, and I think this is a bigger problem for like middle-aged people or people in their 30s. Like the boredom went beyond just like the boredom of adolescence. It was the humiliation of not being able to provide for yourself. Whatever you were given, it was handed to you, and I just felt like you had no agency, and I could feel people just being driven to madness by that. It was driving them nuts, and they would have done anything even if there was no pay for it. If there was a voucher system, or you told them to go build something or clean something up, and that would have been more rewarding for them than just sitting around in the sun of your eyes for 12 hours at a time.
I'd like to add to that too. I believe the saying is idle hands serve the task of the devil, if I remember correctly. So I have 2 quick points. First of all, from the point of ingenuity, the informal economy is thriving. You have fryers, like vegetable stands, barbers, all showing up in every corner of the camp. And in addition to that, I was speaking to 2 fighting age males in Turkey when they started to digress from the interview, and they were talking about how a lot of the families, their kids have made makeshift carts, and they'd be getting all the pastries that their mothers would be cooking, and they'd be selling it on the streets and generating an income for the family. And they were very proud of that fact, and that's something that I heard a lot from the Syrians in general. They have the saying, "Fen ma tirmi Suri yugaf," so wherever you place a Syrian, they will come up standing, essentially. So, and another part of this, when you have such a population that has become quite familiar with smuggling, since they've been dealing with people who smuggle people, I don't think it's far-fetched to assume that these people smuggle drugs, weapons, and so on and so forth. I noticed that in one of the camps, all of the cigarettes were all Marlboro Reds with a Dutch smoking warning. So they were bulk bought and smuggled over from Holland, and apparently they cost €1.50 a pack. So, and they came up with a pretty smart way to meet their smoking needs. That's all. If anyone would like to add.
Madam over here.
My name is Lila Al-Hajjar. I also conducted research in Jordan. So as a researcher, you all spoke about the emotional roller coaster, just taking all these different elements, your background, the refugees' background, and all the different elements that you have to take into account when you start that interview. So I have 2 questions. What makes you keep going with research and still interested in this, even with all the stuff that goes on in your head? And how do you cope when you're in that roller coaster and all these things are going on, and just comparing your life and their life and all the things that you guys mentioned in your talks? Thank you.
Alex, would you like to try that one?
Sure. So
I
for the first question,
the first
sorry,
problems
go
I've
ahead.
ever had when I started is that the emotional toll that it takes on you, hearing the tragedies and the things that these people go through will hit you, no matter how long you've been doing it. Like I said, I've been doing this for 2 years, and I think no, I've got this under control. And then you just hear that one simple story that just breaks you. One thing to always remember is that, you are a single person. You can't fix the world's problem. And I'm not saying this in a negative context, but in a way to be realistic. In a way to keep things going for me is that, yes, I'm one person who can't solve all the world problems, and I'm just an academic, and I'm just doing research that may or may not help these people eventually. But sometimes I think of it, in a way is that, these people don't have a way to let it out. One of the camps I visited here is basically a prison. There's less than 400 people in that they've seen each other's faces for the past 5 years, who don't go out. They know nothing about what's going on around the outside world. They're basically in a prison camp. So I was the new face that was around every day. So they're like, they want to let it out. So sometimes I'm like, even if it's hard, even if this is not beneficial for the research, this is why I say sometimes just, even if they're talking about things that aren't related, just let them do it, because the least you can do is that you lend them an ear, you know, you're somebody who heard their issues outside of this world, outside of the environment they're in, outside of the other people, because like if I'm a Syrian complaining to another Syrian, they understand what I'm going through, there's no point. But you're complaining to someone that, you know, is basically on the other side, that doesn't see what you're going through. So I've always personally seen this as a way, and I've had a lot of people say, just tell me to my face, just let me talk, just let me say, I just want to let it all off my chest. And I was like, please go ahead, like I'm here to listen. That's from their perspective. But you also have to remember to take care of yourself as well. When you feel the pressure, when you are upset, when you're not capable of handling this anymore, and you just basically feel depressed and this is like a really bad world, take a break. It's okay to take a break, to talk to a friend, a family member, a colleague who's going through the same thing. Let it off your chest to someone else. Take a break, go out one night, go for dinner, do something that makes you happy, and then just come back in a fresh slate, because you aren't going to benefit them or yourself if you're pressuring yourself, if you're under a lot of pressure and you're upset and you're depressed and you're angry and they're angry and you're crying and they're crying. It doesn't work well. So in order for you to benefit them, even in the littlest amounts, you need to be okay. You need to be on your 100%. So sometimes even I've said it, like I said, looked at a colleague who I was translating for, I was like, look, I can't go these like 4 interviews this one day and then 5 interviews yesterday, and I need a break. I need a human break. This is too much to handle. So she was like, okay, I understand. I took a break for the day. I went and I saw a friend and I just let out. I honestly cried out to that friend and let it all out. And just, it makes you feel better. And then, you know, take a day or 2 off. When you feel that you're good, go back onto it. So don't be completely frustrated that you can't immediately help that person. Try to think of the little things that are helpful for that, and, you know, take a break and take care of yourself before anything else.
Alex, do you have any thoughts on
yeah, just to go off of what Maysam was saying, I also shared the same emotional roller coaster that you described, especially because I'm a Syrian. You know, I felt really bad that, yes, we're both Syrian, but legally I had the privilege to be able to, you know, move freely when these people couldn't really see any sort of future in sight. And so for me, while I was volunteering, that first part, I just went into like this workaholic mode, because whenever I didn't have anything to do, I just didn't know what to do with myself. And so I think doing that, no one should really do that. I think, like my son was saying, I think it's really important to just take a break, do something else, and then so that you can gain back that energy and go back freshly into the work that you're doing. And then for the first point that you were saying, I did at times feel guilty because I just felt like the small person, and you know, I doubted how much of an impact I was going to be able to have. But then I realized that, you know, at a minimum, the impact that you can have is by sharing these stories of these people who don't have any sort of platform to vent to someone. And a lot of people, because I was Syrian, they saw it as a symbol of hope. They were like, oh, well, we see that you're Syrian and you've accomplished all these things, and so, you know, this gives us hope that maybe our daughter could do the same types of things that you're doing. And so for me, even if I lost hope at times, because when you're doing research, you have to stick to this objective stance and try and distance yourself, because you don't want to, you know, create any type of bias. At a minimum, again, I just found that, you know, it would at least be an outlet to share these people's stories.
We have about 8 more minutes, so perhaps could we collect, I know there was a question there, and maybe collect 2 more questions, and then we'll have the panel starting with Lisa, who we neglected.
Sure.
Thank you so much, everybody. This has been wonderful. I am a doctoral student at the Ed School studying education in settings of armed conflict, and I was wondering whether the issue of education came up at all during the interviews, either as something to hope for or an antidote to despair or something that has failed individuals or whatever it might be. And if not, whether you have any thoughts about the role that education could play in the settings where you were working.
Lisa, do you have any thoughts on that?
Since I did my research in Germany, I might not be the right person to answer this. So although I have two things, just briefly, it did come up during the interviews or during the conversations that I had with the refugees. Mostly they told me how in Turkey or other countries their kids didn't go to school, they were neglected, and they didn't have an education and now we're lagging behind, and that they were hoping that here in Germany, and actually some of the kids already went to school, and they were very proudly showing me these pictures, like photo books, of their kids that had already taken part in, participated in some like class excursions, where I went as a kid as well. So that was funny. But I could relate because of that. And then also education in a way, and the adults mostly who know, they came to Germany not knowing the language, and now they are waiting to get their education. They're waiting to get a spot in a German class. So that is something else that I know comes to my mind when we speak of education. Probably something different that you had in mind, but still, and it sometimes takes forever for them to get a spot in those classes. And this goes back to the boredom issue that we talked about. So I met with a refugee in Hamburg. We did the interview in German. We talked for about 2.5 hours. We did the whole interview in German. He had not participated in one German lesson. He has taught himself. So 2 weeks ago, he went to his first German class. That was really amazing. And some go to German classes, some don't, some just teach themselves. But that's on education in Germany.
That's actually a question that interests me a lot. I believe in the most recent report I read, the numbers were stating that among the 800,000 kids in Turkey, it's assumed that only 25% are attending school. The rest we can assume are either working, idle, or in child labor. Of course, the face-forward issue here is we're having a good majority of the population that is essentially idle, human capital that the country could theoretically benefit from in the best way, in the best sense of the word. But I think the issue is language is the primary issue. So when you have a refugee between the ages of, I'd say, 30 and over, it automatically becomes an issue where that person more or less won't have the capacity to go and learn a new language, and will therefore most of the time be overqualified in whatever job he or she will be working in, but only because that person can't speak the language. We've seen a couple of schools in Istanbul that show up that are not set up by the government, very informal, but aim at teaching the younger generation to speak the language. I personally think it's a top priority if they want to actually utilize the refugee population and create a stable and create a healthy human capital out of them.
Can I add one thing? In Germany, also, it's not only the language that they need to learn, obviously, but for them, education in Germany, it's a whole. I think there's a whole different dynamic, because for them, education in Germany is key to the better future. They've come to Germany, they've risked everything, sometimes sold everything to come to Germany, and now for them education means a better future, the future that they have been dreaming of for like the past, I don't know, sometimes 3 or 4 years. So we have like go to university, go back to their old jobs, which is very, very difficult and doesn't happen very often. But even learning a new job. I interviewed one guy. He left Syria when he was in his 5th semester of some engineering. He did some kind of engineering. He went back, or he came to Germany and did an internship. Interned as a hairdresser. So it's a very, very interesting dynamic, I think.
Similarly, in Lesbos, a lot of the families that I interviewed had the same concern, this concern of, a lost generation. And again, with the whole point about boredom, they don't know what to do with their children because there aren't any schools in place. In Greece, the NGO that I worked with wanted to try and set up some type of informal educational system, but it wasn't allowed to do so because the Greek government just want those camps there to be kind of like a transition destination. They don't want it to be that final destination, and so they don't have those systems in place. But I think after the World Humanitarian Summit that happened in Istanbul, that was an issue that came up because education doesn't fall within the field of humanitarian work because it's not acute. And then it doesn't fall within the realm of development work, and so that was something that came up because given the protracted nature of conflicts, it is a concern to fill that gap.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but before you join me in thunderous applause to thank our panelists, I hope the panel I'm sure, in fact, the panel has massaged not just your intellectual muscles, but your humanitarian, perhaps political even muscles. But all of that is for naught if you just listen to these courageous people and just go home, if you don't take some further steps to become involved or to at least read about the problem. So I do encourage you before you leave to please sign up, and we won't abuse it in any spamming way. Could you please join me in thanking the panelists?